Thank you and welcome. My name is Dave Trier. I'm the VP of Product at ModelOp. ModelOp provides best-in-class enterprise model production solution called ModelOp Center. For the past 5 years, we've been focused on the large enterprise, often highly regulated industries, and specifically, ModelOp Center addresses the wide variety of problems around the operationalization of AI and ML models as they impact existing business and technical processes. For example, in the areas of compliance and risk management, which we'll be talking about today, as well as technical processes such as SecOps, DevOps, IT Ops, and importantly, the modeling processes such as data science. Today with us, we have Avi Kalderon, who thank you so much for joining. Avi, I'll allow you to introduce yourself, but Avi is the CEO of Opening Bell Ventures. Avi, would you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, and my pleasure to participate. My name is Avi Kalderon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Opening Bell Ventures. We are a professional services firm that employs highly seasoned practitioners to help large financial services enterprises and banks address data management and analytics in an effective and responsible manner, whether it's monetization opportunities, whether it's optimization of analytics and decision support systems, or whether it's risk management and compliance. We help accelerate your digital journey in these fields and really help you think through the more complex, cutting-edge issues our industry is facing today, especially as digitization is accelerating this year without any advance notice.
Great. And thanks again for joining me, Avi. Today, the focus of our session will be on operationalizing AI and ML with the proper risk management and controls. I'm really excited to have a quick chat with you about this overall, Avi. So as I think about this
topic.
As I think about this particular topic, maybe we just start with your experiences, Avi, in working with these large enterprises on the typical challenges and concerns that many of the AI ML leaders are facing, especially in regards to risk and management when they're trying to operationalize these AI and ML models.
Sure. The challenge is very symptomatic to any new capability that's introduced in large organizations. Innovation always trailblazes the ability to actually record, monitor, comply, and actually understand what's happening in an enterprise. And the challenges with areas such as model development and artificial intelligence and operationalizing them in a responsible manner, and I'll use the word responsible quite a bit, is getting your arms around what's in the industry and having the right tool sets to actually enable policy management. These are very new tools. There's a lot of technologies and capabilities that are experimented with in many enterprises and financial services. And it's not a mature practice yet. So the challenge is building the right knowledge in the organization to actually know where the data and analytics and models are, to know who manages them and how they're being managed, and the third, which is most important, be able to prove it. So building that methodology and the process from the data scientists who deal with the statistics, with the numbers, with the data, with the inputs and outputs, and with the algorithms, and that organizational process and discipline to hand off their work product into a more rigorous capability that runs, is transparent and monitored, performant, and always understandable in terms of the inputs and outputs that go into that from a risk management perspective, is really the challenge. It's building that methodology and process and organizational awareness at large scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And really, in our experience, we're seeing much of the same in a large enterprise. And actually, obviously, models have been around for a very long time, but that problem is actually exacerbated by the fact that the use of models, including AI and ML, are growing in scale and complexity. And we worked with a lot of large enterprises that have really a plethora of model execution environments, 5, 10, 15 model execution environments. And now they have all these new groups that are starting to develop new models with different model development platforms, different languages, different frameworks, and different types of business applications that are consuming those. And the ones that we worked with, a lot of them are struggling to understand what's that right overall governance process. We call it a model lifecycle, but what's that right overall governance process to ensure there's the right level of consistency and controls and not stymieing innovation? And this really involves working with a combination of different teams, business teams, data scientists, IT, MRM, production support across process technology, and as you mentioned, the collaboration amongst them. So this really leads to my next question is, as you think about it and as you've helped many of your large customers, what really should a good model operation framework look like to make sure there's proper operational and risk management practices and processes?
Great question. And let's start with the people's aspect. Like everything else, when you build a new capability, it's people, process, technology, and in this case, information or data. The people involved in this life cycle are of disparate personalities and teams in the organization. First of all, you have the people who develop the models, they're data scientists. They're scientists in nature, they like cool stuff, they like statistics, they like numbers, they like their risk management profiles. They're not so much process-oriented people. They like to get their hands on as much data as they can and play around with it, whether they have enterprise tools or desktop tools, or they've downloaded the latest open source library to toy around with, right? They like the puzzle, they like to solve the problem. They don't like the ongoing monitoring, the ongoing training, the ongoing life and care, or the life cycle, check the box that you've deployed to this server or that server and so on. That's
Right.
not of their concern. And you have to cater for those personalities and wrap them around with people who are process oriented, but to your point, do not stifle the innovation that comes from the data science group. So here comes the challenge with the other set of personalities. IT individuals are highly rigorous, they're process oriented, they're audit driven, they like everything to be documented, codified, understandable, contained, and they don't like what data scientists do. They download all sort of new libraries, they download all sort of new tools. The architects and the IT people like containment and small number of moving pieces, right? So there's a natural dichotomy between these two organizations, and really what you need is a set of tools and enabling policies, right, that actually link the two. Sometimes you actually need to have a team in between, like a handoff team or a deployment team, a team that understands and can translate between the two personalities, the two type of organizations, but it can only be enabled with the use of effective tools that manage that process from inception to production runtime. And those tools are pretty sparse because the whole capability involves a lot of technologies. It's a proliferation of data and software, and where the industry over the last 20 years have worked on containment of software capabilities, this introduced distribution of a lot more new tools. So really, the key here is to look at enabling a governing capability at the organization to establish some policies, as well as education, coaching, and go-to points of contact that can help um, mitigate the risks and also negotiate the handoffs between data scientists and the actual counterpart that are the operations people that maintain those capabilities in runtime. There's an old saying that says that data scientists keep everything in beta because they don't know how to actually give things to production people, and that they spend 80% of their time actually managing runtime environments and 20% of their time actually doing their job, which is data science. And that's an indication of the young age of these capabilities today. and the need to actually establish proper coaching, education, policies, and an enabling tool set that's flexible enough to cater to both personalities.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, Avi. And again, in our experience, really, because you have these disparate groups, each of which have their own motivation, their own passions, their own skill sets, their own KPIs, right? But AI, ML, and models in general require all of them to come together. That's
Everything.
why for us in our experience is having an organizing construct for which all of those teams can work together to identify what that process is that includes not just the technical, but also the business requirements, the overall compliance and risk requirements in a way that they can actually concretely come together and say, here's what that overall flow looks like. Again, we call it a model life cycle. Here's what that looks like. Here's where everybody is involved in the process. And here's the responsibilities and accountabilities, most importantly, for all those different groups as they work to operationalize those models and keep those models performing at the highest regard, obviously, with the best outcome for the business. And we call those overarching processes model life cycles, which again, in our experience, but also been validated recently by Gartners and Forresters. Those model life cycles and model ops in general is vital to the success of an enterprise AI program. And so what we see is that these model life cycles help to ensure traceability and auditability to get those models operationalized. But more importantly, the next step actually is that you can automate those model life cycles, which really leads me to my next topic, which is automation, right? So as we think about it, there's a lot of competitive and internal pressures to speed model delivery and keep pace with the market demands. How are you seeing automation helping to drive scale and efficiency when operationalizing models? And in particular, when working with first and second line teams within MRM compliance as a whole.
So automation is key to all of this. As described, it's different personalities. It's the rigorous process that's required. It takes typically 4 to 5 individuals in an organization to make something happen. So it's the business person, which in this case is the data scientist. It's their counterpart in IT, which is the person or the team that's actually going to take control over things in runtime to actually monitor and make sure that the thing scales and performs. And then in the middle, there's typically your internal auditors that want, or compliance people that want to make sure that everything checks the right boxes and actually complies with regulation and with internal audit procedures, as well as some level of an operational legal representation, because in these cases, when you start dealing with AI and decision support systems, or decision-making systems, you want to make sure that the legal aspects of what you're trying to deploy are well covered and the policies are well defined in both in code and in runtime. So automation is key to connect these pieces together to actually be able to trace the information from the inception, the data inputs, the algorithmics capabilities and the transparency within the algorithm, all the way to how it's actually being packaged, being deployed, runs, the data sets that it runs on, the version management for that, and the ability to always go back and say, okay, well, the system has made a recommendation or a decision X. Do we have the inputs at that point in time that fed into the model and the outputs and why the system made that decision? Because those decisions often come into play and come into questions when the decision feels wrong. So automation, to the handoff, to the archiving of the data, to the version management of the algorithms, and to the actual monitoring of each and every runtime model is the only way to scale these things in an organization. An organization that runs 5 models can monitor and kind of track them in an Excel spreadsheet, but most organizations run thousands and thousands of models, whether they're simple algorithms, whether they're machine learning, or whether they're AI models. Without the ability to actually provide that traceability, inventory, policy management, alerting, monitoring, and enforcement in an automated way, you can't really manage this, and you can't really answer the simplest questions of which model ran on which data and what decision did it spit out and why.
Yeah, absolutely, Avi. And you mentioned that, most organizations have 1,000 models, right? But I've talked to several very large Fortune 500s that have aspirations to have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even one very aspirational lead within a Fortune 500 said 1 million models. Because if you start to think about it, when you get to hyper personalization, especially in the digital space, you may have a model per customer out there, right? So I couldn't agree more that getting to scale, getting to that sort of scale, you need a proper automation framework to ensure that you're operationalizing those models, but again, still within that consistency and control that you need to ensure you have that compliance and regulatory adherence, and of course your brand reputation as well. You want to make sure those models are operating within what you would expect from a business perspective and compliance and brand. So this really actually,
And just 1 second, related to that, we've solved this as an industry in the last 2 decades with software, where there's the concepts of automated deployment and continuous integration
Mhm.
and monitoring and so on in your data centers and in the cloud. With models, it's a permutation that makes it a slightly more complex because it's a lot more tools and technologies, and it involves the automation of the data sets, which software does not worry about. So these are areas that automation is critical for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often get the question is saying, it's like, well, what isn't this just, isn't model operations or model ops, isn't that just DevOps applied to machine learning? And we have to remind them that actually models are not the same as software, right? They're constantly changing. They're not deterministic, they're probabilistic, right? And you need to constantly monitor them, especially within regulated industries, to make sure that they're not deviating from some of your original assumptions, right? And so
Absolutely.
that's a constant discussion that we have as to how this is different than traditional software, and is really what led to a lot of the requirements behind our software ModelOp Center to allow for that model-centric view, to have that operational automation and control of the model lifecycle and everything related to the model. Having that model-centric view is vitally important because it is a unique type of software. So I
Absolutely.
wanted to, if we can, Avi, I wanted to actually peel back the onion a little bit on what you started to mention with monitoring and controls. And really, when I talked with model risk executives overall, one of the most important functions that a model risk program needs to address, especially with AI and ML, is thinking about what happens when a model goes wrong. Because a model probably will go wrong, right, at some point. And what
Always.
damage can that model create? Again, from a business perspective, from a regulatory perspective, or from a brand reputation perspective. So maybe if you could just expand upon your perspective around monitoring in a little more details. And again, the controls to make sure that those models are performing within their bounds and adhering to the regulatory compliance and company standards.
So, because models are non-deterministic and because we actually gradually give more autonomy to models, not to just make recommendations to a human being, but also to make decisions instead of a human being in an organization, it's not a question that they can go wrong. They will go wrong, right? And when they go wrong, there's a spectrum of damage that they may be presenting, right? It could be in a hyper personalization, it could be they made a wrong decision on an individual, right? But also at scale, they may make wrong decisions on your entire client base, right? And understanding what went wrong requires the understanding of both the model from a transparency perspective, the training sets and the decision parameters into it that went into it and went out of it, and the version that it actually ran, whether it's A/B testing, whether it's a new version deployed, and so on and so forth. So the capabilities are pretty wide when it needs to actually be monitored. It needs to be monitored for the typical things: uptime, performance, response time, and so on, the typical IT things. Then it needs to be modeled for the actual data that came in, data sets that came in, availability of the data sets, correctness and quality of the data sets, relevance of the data sets, as well as the data that comes out, the actual relevance of the data, the transparency of what the algorithm was performing, why, the reasoning why it was performing the way it was performing, or the decision that it made a decision. Macro conditions, how does that model fit in your business landscape, and has it made decisions that are not within the macro conditions or need to be tweaked for your macro conditions? So this goes into policies, this goes into business objectives and business goals, and performance management and benchmarking against those of the results of the models. And then lastly, I would add the concept of ethics. Just because a model came out with correct answer does not mean that it's the right answer for you, right? So the ability to understand the correct answer from the right answers in terms of your company's values and principles, biases or non-biases related to that, all of that needs to be monitored. All of this needs to be tested in an A/B testing environment, in production. Data sets that come back in a closed loop into your training data sets to actually improve decisions. All of those variables are very different than software monitoring. Software is a closed system that does not deviate from the way it's programmed. Models are the exact opposite. They're actually built to improve themselves, to tune themselves, to self-monitor, and sometimes they will do that wrong. They will not improve themselves, they will degrade themselves. So all those parameters, all those knobs need to be watched, need to be monitored, needs to be tweaked, and version managed. When something goes wrong, you need to have a kill switch or the ability to revert to a previous version or to a simple non-deterministic model to more deterministic algorithms while you troubleshoot what went wrong. So the capabilities of actually being able to monitor, being able to enforce certain thresholds, measure and enforce certain threshold, roll back or kill a model are critical in a production environment these days.
Yeah, absolutely, Avi. And I'd actually extend that list or complement that list to actually have a feedback loop to MRM teams as well, right? So you're monitoring everything that you mentioned. And in particular, what we found more recently is starting to monitor some of the MRM supplied approvals and conditions, right? To making sure that all models are adhering to those conditions. Something as simple as that haven't passed their expiration date, but there can be more fine-grained conditions that they're only suited to, these models are only suited to be used for this particular purpose. And unfortunately, we found in our experience, even the most advanced of enterprises struggle with answering the basic question. What are all the models that are running in production? Meaning they are making business decisions for that overall enterprise. And again, as we talked about earlier, this problem actually gets exacerbated by the increasing number of model frameworks, model execution platforms, model types. And what we're starting to see is this is when an enterprise starts to look towards finding a model operations or production technology to help them to manage some of that complexity of the monitoring and then most importantly, that feedback loop to the MRM and governance teams and making sure that those models are actually adhering to what was supplied in terms of approvals. So again, I think it's such a great topic overall that I continue to have discussions, and I'm sure you do as well with your customers around making sure there's proper monitoring and feedback loops around it. So
Absolutely.
let me, if we can, let's switch gears one more time, but one last question. And really this is in regards to a lot of times when having conversations with executives, especially on the model risk side, they come back and say, it's like, well, we're just not mature enough yet. We're just starting our AI and ML journey, right? And then I pressed them a bit and they said, well, actually, we're pretty far along in we have this strategic digitization journey. And when I ask them about that, they're actually pretty far along on it. And what's happening then is that actually causes that realization that, oh man, maybe I should be thinking about some of this. So especially with COVID now, and pushing digitization strategies into hyperdrive for many enterprises. How have you seen that push forward an AI and ML production strategy overall?
So this is great. It looks back to the first three principles of know where the models are, know who owns them, be able to prove it. What we've seen in COVID days is the proliferation of those models in remote workforces is exponential. The fact that people don't sit next to each other or don't show up in conference rooms to meetings to discuss what they're being deployed gives a lot more autonomy to individuals and teams to actually progress and do things. And because it's a remote workforce, the detection mechanism of how things actually get into the hands of a production capability are not very effective. So what we've seen is a proliferation of the need for automation. The cycle times for actually putting things in production shortens significantly, but also the communications about it is almost non-existent because it's more of a send and forget versus actually let's talk about what we need to do in a proactive manner. And so the registries of those models are non-existent. Most organizations, they'll talk about being behind the curve or with the trends or ahead of the curves, but all those are not actually based on hard data of what they actually have, both in the development pipeline and running in production. Most organizations are still having a hard time inventorying their data, not to talk about inventorying their models and their algorithms. This is not an easy thing to do at scale, and it gets very much harder to do when you don't have the proper teams and committees and commitment to do that because most people manage their own schedule in disparate locations. And they push a button and suddenly something shows up in production. Nobody even knows that it went there.
Right.
And these are significant struggles that large scale organizations deal with in COVID times.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Avi. So we're running out of time. So I just have one last question. Any advice that you would offer to fellow executives around pitfalls or where they should get started in regards to AI and ML and their model risk policies and processes?
Yeah, we all tend to be reactive in relation to new things that we either don't understand or don't pop up on our radar as a top priority. We react when something bad happens, and then suddenly all the alarm bells and alerts starting to happen with respect to, oh, we haven't thought about this. So one of the advice that I would leave the audience with is this is a real problem. It's an exponentially growing problem. I would advise you to be proactive on establishing the right organizational policies, the right organizational team members to think about that, the governing boards and governing committees and processes to actually handle this while it's still manageable and at a scale that you can get your arms around. Establish an incident response team for when things go wrong, establish a development lifecycle process of handoffs, establish a registry and a capability to know what runs. Because if you have 1,000 models that run, it's a containable problem that you can get ahead of. But if you have 100,000 or a million, when something goes wrong, it puts you down in a huge scale. So my advice is become proactive on establish the model development lifecycle, understand who are the key players, understand how to bring them together and establish compliance and policies and adherence and deploying the right tool sets while you're still ahead of that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Being proactive is definitely the number one recommendation that I would give to executives as well. Exactly as you just said, having the right processes, bringing the appropriate folks to the table, and focusing on that model lifecycle around the overall workflow, governance, etc. And thinking about how you get to scale because it'll creep up on you, right? And you'll be there eventually, and you don't want to be in that reactive mode where you're unfortunately having to pay fines or other even worse problems overall.
Correct.
So again, thanks so much for joining, Avi. Thanks for talking with me today about how we operationalize AI with proper risk management and controls. And again, I appreciate all that we're able to join and attend this session. So thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.